Wow, what a wonderful welcoming, everyone. Thank you so much. So, I'm here to talk about childhood trauma. And I want to preface this by saying right now I do work with women at the Empowerment Center that are transitioning into independent living from prison, jail, people that come off the streets. I have had some work with family domains where we go in and we work and administer to children as the identified patients and work with the family, as I was telling you earlier, as a whole to help them function more optimally. So today, where's my PowerPoint? Aha, there we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about childhood trauma on the next slide. This is our agenda. So, how many of us know what childhood trauma is? Not so many. So, we'll start with the definition. Okay, good. A lot of things. You're absolutely right. We're going to define it so that we all have a working definition of what that looks like. We're going to look at the causes. We're going to jump into the signs and symptoms, understand the impact, what that looks like when you see these children acting out. And then we'll just jump into some treatments, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end if we have time. All right. So the definition, really good, right? It could be anything. The difference between child trauma and adult trauma is actually quite different. The same but different. Children can adopt trauma symptoms from environments much more easily and readily than adults tend to. Childhood trauma refers to a scary, dangerous, violent, or life-threatening event that happens to a child between the ages of 0 and 18. Those are the formative, developmental stages of children's lives, and we see the impacts typically come during that childhood time frame. And then they take those ways of coping with those traumas and stressors into their adult lives. And so in childhood, we really want to do some of this work with the kids to help them function more optimally and take those skills, if you will, into adulthood in more meaningful ways. Trauma may also happen to someone your child knows. So if something happens to a child's friend and it impacts them in a deep way, that can be very traumatizing for a child. When these types of experiences happen, your child may become very overwhelmed, upset, or feel helpless. These types of experiences can happen to anyone at any time and at any age. However, not all events have a traumatic impact. What do you think that means? Exactly. And oftentimes it impacts children that are in environments that are not conducive to growth and development. So if a child is impacted more deeply, we might want to look at that child and find out what's going on in the home and sort of dig into that a little bit. A child that comes from maybe a more stable environment may have trauma, but they are not impacted by it in such a severe way. Right? Does that make sense? So I wanted to, any thoughts or questions about definition? We kind of have a working understanding of what trauma, childhood trauma looks like. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So I wanted to jump into this. And I think it's a really good depiction of how we can break this down to understand environments. Okay, so this is the tale of two wolves, and maybe many of you have heard this, but we're going to read it again. So one evening, an old Cherokee told his grandson about a battle that goes on inside of people. He said, "My son, the battle is between two wolves inside us all. One is evil. It is anger, envy, jealousy, doubt, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, resentment, guilt, superiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. The other is good. It is joy. Can you hear me still? Okay. I didn't have the echo. So. The other is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, forgiveness, truth, compassion, and faith. The grandson thought about it for a moment and then asked his grandfather, which wolf wins? The old Cherokee simply replied, the one you feed. Now, I want to stop here and reflect on this because very, very, very valid when you're looking at children growing up in difficult environments. If a child is fed the wrong things or the negative things or the things that are about survival, and perhaps there's domestic violence in the home, perhaps there's abuse, neglect, abandonment. My mom's not here. Where is she? Who's going to feed me? When these children are exposed to that type of environment, what do you think they're fed? And conversely, when a child is brought up in a home that is connected and worthy, and that is emotionally present and there for a child, they tend to have different outcomes. And trauma isn't so great. And again, children don't fully understand how to function growing up. They are reliant upon their environment and their caregivers in great ways that help guide them. And that's perhaps our job at times, is to help guide them where and when we can in positive ways that help support the right thing for them. I like that story. Anybody like that? That was a good one, huh? Okay, so on the next slide, children are what we teach them. So if we teach them how to survive, or perhaps they teach themselves how to survive, which is often the case in very dysfunctional environments or homes, they don't really learn how to cope in effective, promising ways. So children that are raised in abusive, violent, neglectful, permissive environments often detach and learn survival skills versus coping skills. So physical, sexual, verbal, all of those, and emotional abuse. Anyone think of some ways that comes across that maybe in a child's current child that you're working with, and how that might be present?
I've noticed before that kids have a tendency to shut down.
Definitely.
Like they won't speak at all, so that you don't have to question them, or so that they don't have to talk about their past.
Avoidance. Yeah. Well, they don't know how, is probably the case, or they've been taught not to. How many of us ourselves grew up and were not allowed to express ourselves emotionally in our own families, and we're told, oh, not right now, or shut that down, or we don't talk about that. Buck up. Rub some dirt in it. Yeah, don't be a baby. Yeah.
Or even you're taught to lie. I
Yes.
was taught to lie when I was young. Don't tell the people at school. Don't say this.
Mhm.
So then at a young age, I'm hiding, lies.
Right. So what have you really been taught? Not to express yourself, not to tell the truth, and that can be very traumatizing to a child. What do I do with all this emotion? Right? So the pattern of behavior we focus our energy on is the one that prevails in expressing itself. So what does this mean when a child is brought up with dysfunctional coping skills, or what I might call as survival skills versus coping skills? How do they bring those into adulthood in the same way, right? And so a lot of us find that as we grow up and we step into adulthood, we're still behaving in the same way that we were raised, until we start to learn different ways of coping, and hopefully healthy ways of coping. So a lot of those behaviors end up in mental illnesses, medical problems, addiction problems, legal issues, all sorts of things that can arise when I'm dealing with the same issues in the same way as I did when I was 6 slides. So some of the causes, let's jump into those. So some of the causes, and I like this quote. This isn't mine. I picked this up somewhere along the road of education. Where focus goes, energy flows. So what we teach our children is what they become often. Some of the causes for childhood trauma end up to be, and again, we're going to look at this mostly in the home because hopefully that's where the children are, right? They're not out on the street being raised by, well, sometimes they're in foster homes, CPS cases, raised by grandma, grandpa, distant family member, friends. But abuse, physical, emotional, sexual abuse tends to cause a great deal of trauma. And I would say that, and I don't have the statistics on this, but probably the number one cause of childhood trauma. Neglect. Neglect looks like physical neglect. Child's dirty, doesn't have food, doesn't know where my next meal or when am I going to see my mom next or who's going to take care of me or who's going to wash my clothes, who's going to take me to school. These types of things cause a great deal of stress for children. And emotional neglect, kind of what we talked about earlier. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about emotions. Shut that down. If children can't express themselves emotionally, what do they do with all that emotion? Nothing. They learn to compartmentalize it and suppress it so that they don't deal with it because they've never been taught how to deal with it. Make sense? Household dysfunction can look like somebody in the home having a mental illness. Mom has chronic depression. She lays in bed for 18 hours of the day. Incarcerated relatives. Dad, mom, brother, sister, no longer in the home, can't have that developing relationship with someone who's not there, right? Don't get to see them, don't have the opportunity to have a relationship with somebody if they're incarcerated. Definite impact here is trauma. It can cause trauma. Mother is treated violently. So if I watch my mom, and it's not just mom, but siblings that are abused in front of you as a child, has a traumatic impact. I see this. And oftentimes what we find is that children normalize that behavior and then come up through their years and become abusers themselves because that's what they've seen and that's kind of normalized in their home and that's what they know. Substance abuse, same implication here. So if I grow up in an environment that's fraught with substance use, drinking, drugging, whatever that looks like in that home, number one, as a child, I normalize it, and then I do it. And or conversely, I might see friends do that in his home, and I'm there a lot. And Dad comes home, he cracks a beer, sits in front of the TV, cracks another one and another one and another one, and he learns that, well, in order to relax, I guess I need to drink alcohol, right? Some of these connections are maybe coming into focus for you a little bit. And maybe these are things that you had to witness in your own home growing up. So think about how these have impacted you in your own presentation as an adult in your life. How did you function? How did you cope? Did you think that was normal? And so you did it too. This is the mentality in the developmental stage of a child that believes this, right? Divorce too. How many of us think that divorce impacts children? Definitely can, right? Even amicable divorces can lead to trauma for children. I don't know when I'm going to see mom or dad again. That hurts. Hard. Next slide. This is one of the handouts I believe Nye has. So this is really intended to be a handout that you can take with you to take back to your classrooms or wherever you're teaching or home. But the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experience, is an actual questionnaire that we administer in a clinical setting to help us understand as clinicians and therapists what kind of trauma this particular individual has dealt with, whether it's as an adult or as a child. It can be facilitated and given to any age group. But it, I can get you a copy. Yeah, it's online. You can just, you can Google it. under ACEs questionnaire, and it's a 10-question trauma screen that helps us to understand what kind of trauma we're dealing with in any individual. But these are the things it scopes for. It asks about all of these particular parts of a child's life or an adult child's life, and just some good stuff to sort of help you trigger, like, oh, okay, so this child had physical abuse, neglect, and so on and so forth. So if you want a handout, NIE has it, and this can be downloaded. On the next screen, okay. So the next screen, signs and symptoms. The next slide. Hey, Curtis. Oh gosh, can't even read that. Okay, so this is sort of categorized into 3 groupings. So preschool children tend to be between 0 and 6, and then elementary school children between 6 and 11, and then 12 and 18 as the middle and high school children. But we'll see some different presentations, behavioral presentations in different age groups. So I think it's important to recognize that depending on what age the child that we're dealing with is, they might show symptoms of trauma as it comes out in different ways. So for instance, preschool children, if you see them or hear them, or if they present feeling helpless and uncertain, that might be a sign. Now, these aren't always signs, but these can be signs. And the difference is maybe something happened to that child that he comes to school and he's just feeling a little off today. Different than chronic trauma or violence in the home, right? So if you see these symptoms pervasively and chronically, then we have something to really look at and try to understand. Fear of being separated from their parent or caregiver. Does anybody deal with children 0 to 6? And do you ever see when a child is dropped off by mom or dad and they scream and they show some of that anxiety, separation anxiety? Separation anxiety isn't abnormal. It's when they cannot emotionally regulate, and they cannot bring that level of anxiety or screaming or behavior down within a short period of time, then we may have some need to dig further. But when you have those kids come and they're dropped off, do they tend to regulate their emotions pretty quickly? Mom's gone, out of sight, out of mind? Maybe not. Might want to try finding out what's going on in the home. Maybe. Crying and screaming a lot. Eating poorly or weight loss. Sometimes kids go back to bedwetting, and this is not enuresis, which is a medical term for loss of bladder control, right, in adulthood. But when you see a child that's normally or has been potty trained suddenly go back to this behavior, it might be a sign of something. So again, these are just things to look at as you work with your children, right, moving forward, if you're not already. Returning to using baby talk. So sometimes we see kids regress backwards, developing new fears. Suddenly they come in and they're afraid of everything. It could be a safety issue. I'm afraid because I don't feel safe. Having nightmares certainly is something that I think probably doesn't surprise any of us. They recreate their trauma through play. And if you've ever seen this, it might look like they're playing with Barbie dolls or some kind of action figures and they're hitting each other, right? Or other examples of that you can imagine. They are not developing to the next growth stage. So if they're stuck in that 2 or 3 year old, age frame and they're 6, and you wonder why, some of the things that we can do is take them to their pediatrician and ask, is this child, what's going on, right? Rule out medical issues, change behavioral changes. And then sometimes they ask a lot of questions about death, particularly if someone in the family or close to them has passed away. and they don't know how to process those emotions, um, or if there's a lot of physical abuse in the home where they see mom or dad being beaten, hit, and they are scared. So fear is very a big driving feature here for a lot of our kiddos. Elementary school children, they can become anxious and fearful, uncertain, indecisive, I don't know, worrying about their own or others' safety. Safety is at play, very big. They can become clingy with a teacher or a parent. Happens a lot when they don't have connections and at any strength from home. So I'm not close to my mom or dad, or I'm in a foster care system and I don't have anybody to be close to, so they gravitate towards somebody that they do trust and feel safe with. So you see those relationships begin to happen. They tell others a lot about traumatic events, guilt and shame. They tend to be immersed in guilt and shame and act behaviorally accordingly. They become upset for small things, not just a bump or a bruise, but small little things that, just you wonder, why is this child crying or upset? Ask. Always ask, what's wrong? Never assume, because we never really know until we ask. They have a hard time concentrating. This is typically where you see children diagnosed with ADHD, and very unlikely that child was born with ADHD. It's something that's developed as a protective mechanism to help them function more optimally in their environment. They have numbness. They have fears. The event will happen again. So a child living in fear might look like they're afraid all the time.
When you say they have numbness, is it do you mean like numbness as in like what's going on around them, or like physically in their body?
Could be either. It's typically emotional numbness. So their affect is very flat, or they're not responsive to emotional situations as you would think maybe that a child might be. But I think it's really important here to sort of consider where that comes from. So if a child is at home and mom or dad comes home and they've had a really hard day, and so the first thing they do is use or drink so that they don't have to deal with it, it could be a learned behavior. And so if I'm learning how to numb myself, I may be mimicking that from what I've learned in my environment, or I don't know how to deal with it, and so I'll just dissociate or go blank or have that flat affect. And not go there, I'm learning to suppress it. Two, because I don't know what else to do with it. And that often is the case, because kids, unless they're taught, usually either act out or act in. And so you tend to have two types of behaviors that emerge in children, which are they're acting out in the environment, outbursts, yelling, screaming, hitting, kicking, having tantrums, or they act in where they withdraw and they isolate, or they're quiet, or they shut down. Also, in that elementary school age child developmental stage, they can develop sleeping disturbances. Their grades start to plummet. They become easily they're fearful, so they're always looking over their shoulder. And then in middle and high school children, here's where we start to see some really manifested dysfunction. They feel depressed and alone. They often turn to cutting or self-mutilation, self-injurious behaviors. Eating disorders are developed typically at this time frame. It's about safety and control here. They're learning how to feel safe in their environment by taking what they can and controlling what they can. Because oftentimes their environments are so dysfunctional and unsafe that they withdraw, or they become depressed, or they become overly anxious. You can see it here where they start using substances. Again, maybe that's what they know, or their peer group is engaging in this behavior. So they want to fit in. What do? They're going to go straight to where they can fit in. And maybe that's through drinking or smoking or using drugs, whatever that looks like. They're connected. Think about it like, and we all can relate to this because we're all 13, 14, 15 once. We want to belong. We want to have friends. We want to feel connected. We want to be a part of. So we're going to do whatever it takes to achieve that, right? Sometimes kids at this middle and high school age become sexually active. Again, well, somebody wants me. Right? They can feel like they're going crazy sometimes. I'm not sure that's not all wrong, but feeling different from everyone else. Nobody gets me. I am so misunderstood. Again, that starts in the home from them not being able to perhaps express themselves and being accepted for that. They too may have some sleep disturbances. If there's trauma, they try to avoid places that remind them of the event. I don't want to go home. They start to emotionally numb as well by verbalizing it and suppressing those emotions. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to feel that. I hear that all the time. In my own environment, and I work with adults. And their behaviors start to change too. So again, here you might see behaviors where they're staying out later or they don't listen to you. They're acting out rebelliously, or I'm going to do it, you watch me, right? And so this age group is more vocal. They can be and in their behaviors, and they tend to get very rebellious. Anybody here a rebel growing up? You translate that to what was going on in your home?
Yeah. All the women. Whatever, brother.
So on the next slide, these are some of the impacts. So how do you think, before we jump into this, how do you think trauma impacts children? Some of the things that we just read through the last slide are pretty relevant. But in addition, the impacts that we see on children, and I'll just read this, they have difficulty identifying, expressing, managing emotions, which can lead to their response being unpredictable or explosive. I'm not safe at home. I don't know who I am. Carving out my autonomy is completely misunderstood, and so they start acting out. And sometimes it's conduct order in children, right, in childhood, but it leads to antisocial behaviors as an adult, which can, as you can well imagine, leads to all sorts of repercussions. Getting involved in the legal system. I'm going to jail or prison. Ostracized. I'm a drug dealer, because that's all I know how to do. I don't go to college. This pays better. Heard that one a lot. They face numerous risks, including the risk of being abused and neglected. And as I said earlier, sometimes if they're raised in environments that are traumatic and abusive, it's what they know, and they tend to carry on that in their own adult lives. So they become abusers very frequently. They have difficulty forming positive and healthy relationships. They don't know how. May over-respond or under-respond to situations in their environment. Being learned to dissociate as a defense mechanism. Who knows what dissociation is? When I physically am not present. Different than numbing, although it may be interrelated. No, that's isolation. I'm on purpose isolating. I'm taking myself out of a situation. Dissociation is like I'm present here with you, and suddenly you notice that I'm vacant. And I'm just not here with you mentally or emotionally. I just tend to, it's almost for some people an out-of-body experience. And where they... Yeah. Good example. Absolutely. They form a negative view of the world around them, their own self-worth. So, again, this stems from safety. So, anybody ever meet that one person and you wonder, gosh, why are you mad at the world? That's a good example of this, right? Negative self-view, negative worldview. How I see myself is often how I see the world. Unpredictable, unsafe, right? Unworthy, unlovable, untrustworthy. So big impacts, right? They lack the ability to link consequences with their behaviors. How many of us have seen this or done this, right? It's okay. And then we justify it, make it right and all right. Traumatic experiences in childhood have been linked to increased physical and mental issues that can last into adulthood. So back to the ACEs screen, which you had asked for a copy of, which is you can download online. The implications of that particular screening is pretty big, actually. So if a child, and remember there's 10 questions on there that kind of go into a child's traumatic background. If a child, let's say, or an adult, whoever you're administering it to, scores a higher score, the implications would suggest that this individual has very potential mental illness on board, addiction problems on board, medical issues on board, and that's just the start of it. So the higher the score, the higher likelihood these individuals are to fall into their own personal issues around physical addiction and medical and mental problems. And it results in those problems. I have medical issues, right? Chronic stress. What do we know about chronic stress? These kids are never safe, so they're constantly at a state of hypervigilance or stress, right? So when our bodies are programmed to survive, because I'm in stress mode all the time, it takes away from your immune system working optimally to help keep you, safe physically, right? So I'm more susceptible then if I'm in a high state of stress or trauma, right, environment, I'm more likely to have a compromised immune system as a result, which leads to more problems later in life. Next screen. This is a handout, right, Nye? Okay, so feel free to take that. This is just a compression of some of these impacts, which is attached to the ACE questionnaire, which is online. Next screen here. These are sort of some of the ways that we see childhood trauma affect adults. There's a 2 times more likelihood to develop depression, 3 times more likely to develop anxiety disorders. And anxiety is not just generalized to chronic anxiety, but social phobias, PTSD, a myriad, bipolar disorder, which is both, right? So the initial trauma of a young child impacts the prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking center, right? So if my prefrontal cortex is shut down and everything that I do behaviorally is streamed not through what I think or what I need to do next, but through my survival center, I'm in stress mode 24/7. And so I don't learn how to manage my behaviors. I just do it on impulse. We become very impulsive and react accordingly, like that. These are some of the other centers of the brain that are impacted by trauma that cause dysregulation, emotional problems later. And we already talked about the causes and the long-term effects. And then on the next slide, some of the treatments. So let's jump into that. Behavior is the language of trauma. And I think I was speaking to this effect earlier. Behavior tells us something. So as caregivers, parents, whatever role we take in the lives of our young ones, if a child is acting out, maybe we want to start asking why. Instead of judging the behavior, kind of get curious about the behavior, right? And ask, because it's going to tell us something. And it might just say, well, this child doesn't know how to act any other way. And so, or it could mean something bigger. There could be a bigger implication. Something's going on in the home that we need to investigate or support in a more healthy way. However, some of the treatments, and this is clinical, so we'll go into, in the next few slides, some of the things that you can look for and help these children with. But clinically, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, the evidence-based interventions for childhood trauma are actually developing safety, helping them develop skills that are healthy coping skills, enhancing resiliency that helps them to bounce back when hard things happen in their life. They cannot stay down, but learn how to rise again in a healthy manner. Social integration. Sometimes our kiddos don't know how to play in a room with others. So we teach social integration skills. And the one that I find most effective is working with the family. So we have a kiddo that is acting out in our classrooms, and one of the most effective treatments that I have personally been involved with is taking that treatment into the home, understanding what's going on in the home and helping the family as a system function more optimally as a whole. And again, some of these caveats under here, parenting skills. You know, how many of us wish we'd have had parenting skills growing up? Boy, wish, kids had a manual. Emotion regulation. What does a child do with all that emotion when it comes up? Oftentimes kids, and maybe you can realize this in your own upbringing, we just don't talk about that. Learning how to communicate effectively. And then boundaries. We all have them. Nobody likes them, but we all have them, right? Okay, so on the next slide, here's where we jump into the 8 steps to helping a young person process childhood trauma, okay? And this is after we notice the signs and symptoms. And hopefully we're all versed in what those may look like. And again, Nye has some handouts on that. But prepare yourself. So if you're a teacher of any capacity, and whether it's in Sunday school, whether it's in school, wherever it is, right? Be prepared to be patient and to look for these signs and symptoms. So to be helpful to a child who has experienced a traumatic event, you need to be calm. So when a child is acting out and I yell at him, what is that going to solve, right? Fire and fire makes a bigger flame. So we want to try to approach these issues with patience and calmness. And oftentimes, and try this, I dare everybody to try this. The next time somebody is raising their voice to you, respond in a very calm voice and see what happens. Establish safety. So again, this ties back to trauma. If a child's coming into your classroom from an unsafe environment, they may be bringing some of those behaviors with them. So how do we sort of establish and teach safety to our kids? Telling them you're safe, right? And maybe asking them, what is safety to you? How can we go there? How can we explore that? So here it says, assure the child that you will stay with her or him, use language that reflects their appropriate age group and their ability to understand what you're saying. So bring it down to a child's level of understanding. So talk to them in a way that they understand when you're trying to describe and help them feel safe. Educate them. So let the child or teen know you can help him. Figure this out together. Right? One of the things that I did with a lot of my kiddos when I was in family treatment was we would teach them appropriate touching. And so bringing that into a family domain was very helpful in understanding children and giving them the ability to set boundaries around that. appropriate touching. We don't just hug anybody. We don't let anybody just touch us anywhere, right? And so there's there's a plethora of wonderful child illustrated books that you could bring into homes and or classrooms and start teaching what that looks like for them. And if you do want a copy of any of these slides or the PowerPoint, Nye is your point of contact. So start slowly. We don't know where these children are coming from, right? We can't just jump in 90 miles an hour often with these kids. We have to probe and ask a lot of questions and start where they're at, sort of find out where they're at so we can meet them where they are and go from there. Establish somatic empathy. So physical. How do you feel? What's that about? Tell me more. Asking them questions that make them feel safe enough to open up and talk to you about what's going on between here and here. Does that make sense? Sense gravity. You and the child are developing a relationship to release trauma and calm the child's autonomic nervous system. That's the part of the nervous system that just acts on its own without your prompting. Invite the child to feel the ground with her feet. So these are grounding techniques. What do you feel? What do you see? Right? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you taste? Touch? Those are somatic sort of integrations that help children know who they are, where they are, and to get grounded in that. The next one, number 7, engage with gravity. So when we can feel, right, when we're stable and we know where we are and we see our feet on the ground, and I see my fingers and I feel, we feel more stable. So integrating some of these sort of grounding techniques with kids help them know where they are, help them feel safe in their own space, in their own skin sometimes. Teaching them how to breathe, teaching them how to release tension. When I feel it across my chest and in my neck, and my face is getting red, how does breathing work for you? Can you take a deep breath in and hold it and then let it out? And count to 4 as you do that. Do you see your feet? What color is the room? Helping them feel part of is often really important to help them begin to learn emotion regulation. Reflect and rest. So what just happened? What did you just learn? Tell me more about that. Giving them ideas and clues on how they can feel safe with you helps them feel safe in their environment as well. And that's it. So, any thoughts or questions? So what happens in childhood doesn't always stay in childhood, as we know. Yes?
Dealing with like a lot of single mothers or single fathers, what's like one of the biggest issues that you see come from that, and how we can, as body of Christ, help that single mother or that single father?
Oh, wow. You know, there's so many things that we can do. For starters, you can support the single parent role, right? And ask, what do you need? Because if mom's not safe and mom's not sure, or dad, or whoever the caregiver is, you can bet the children don't feel safe, right? So I think it starts with feeling, or offering support and help to the single parent to establish stability and safety in and of their own environment so that they can start to allow the child to feel similarly, right? Some of the other things are in your classrooms is to support the child by telling them, teaching them safety, teaching them things that would be important for them to take home. But I think family therapy, big. I would bring both into a therapeutic setting and explore that with them and see where the problems are, because there's really not one answer to that question. It depends on what's going on. Every person, every family is different. So you can't You can't just put a Band-Aid on a compound fracture. You have to, and not just one thing is the problem. It depends on what you're dealing with. Does that help?
So it's almost safe to say, for instance, dad or why are you
And they're both feeling it in their own ways. But if mom behaves a certain way to being abandoned, she's crying and tearful and dysfunctional and can't go to work and isolates in a room, and isn't there emotionally for a child, most likely the child will pick up some of those behaviors as well and think it's normal.
my mom was both single.
Right. So what did you learn from that? You learned how to be angry.
Mom wasn't around. We were beating each other up, fighting over Captain Crunch.
Right. But that is such a perfect example of what we teach our children. And so it's important to educate yourself, as you're all doing, to how you can be more aware of what's going on so that you can maybe change what you're doing to help these situations. Any other questions?
The trauma from kids that from the pandemic, how do you think that it's affected the kids?
I really can't speak to that because I haven't really jumped into any of the research, but from what I know, I can give you a non-clinical answer. I think it's taught our children how to isolate, and I don't think there's been a lot of positive consequences where our upcoming children are concerned, and I think that there's going to be, hopefully, a big social trend to bring back one-on-one integration with how we deal with conflicts and how we deal with socializing, hopefully. But I think it's kind of really emerged in our classrooms and on the playgrounds in pretty shocking ways. A lot of aggression, a lot of behaviors are emerging. But I don't have the research to really back any of that.
I have another question. You mentioned dissociation, where they're kind of just disconnected from everything, and these type of traumas could lead into adulthood, right? How do you go about handling or, just around someone that is dissociated with their identity too, with all that trauma growing up, and now they don't even know who they are. They're disconnected to who they are. How do you deal with it?
Are you talking about an adult or a child?
Yeah, I mean, it starts as a child, right? But it carries into an adult. So when it becomes that deep into it, how do you deal with it?
Depends on the person. It depends on the trauma. It depends on how willing that individual is to actually engage in treatment, how open they are. It just depends. You might start by exploring the trauma and engaging them in some talk around that isn't re-traumatizing them, and establish rapport with that individual's trust. It's okay. Tell me how you feel. This is, just it depends.
Can you suggest any books that somebody could read that's 40 years old or 30 years old that still suffers from childhood trauma, like acceptance or rejection or something like that? Is there, because I know that's a big one. And
The Body Keeps the Score. Besser Vander. The name of the book is The Body Keeps the Score, and it talks about how to deal with trauma. And it not only talks about how to deal with it, but where it comes from, and how we can reintegrate what our emotions about this and in relationship to the trauma is, and how we can start to understand it. And personally, I think understanding something and knowing what it is the first step to changing it. So I can't change what I don't know. And that's sometimes where therapeutic interventions can be very useful, is helping you identify where to start with some of that stuff. I think she had a question.
I have a question real quick. If the trauma is found at a young age, I mean, can they get the therapy? Can it be stopped before they become an adult?
Absolutely. That's absolutely a wonderful question. And yes, if you notice some of these, signs and symptoms that are coming through with the children, and you don't understand it as a caregiver or a parent, then no fault, to ask somebody who can help you identify those, help build the skills in childhood so that they can not carry some of that trauma into adulthood. Yeah, good question. Well, again, I mean, there's just no one answer. It depends on the person. And if, why do you think how old are you, first of all? Let's do how old are you? Or who's saying this? You're 29 and you're a single parent. And how long have you been a parent? And how long have you been dealing with this problem? So I might ask those questions to sort of identify, well, if you haven't healed by now, what are you going to do differently that would help you step into that healing role, right? And secondly, I'm here if you need me. You can take a horse to water, but you cannot make him drink. So think about that. In therapeutic terms, that doesn't mean that I'm going to force you into therapy and fix you. That means I'll meet you where you're at. If you're not willing to engage in therapy or pursue healing in a different way, do you really think you're going to heal? And if you think you can, good for you. Let me know how that's going.
What are some of the reasons why people don't want to heal? Like you try to help them, and you try to point out different things in their life, and they're like, they really don't want it. What are some of the? There's probably a whole bunch of them, but what are some of the main
Denial.
ones? Denial.
I'm comfortable. I don't want to feel uncomfortable. I don't want to feel distress. I don't know what to do with that. I'm incompetent. I'm not worthy. I'm unlovable. There's so much that is just impacting these individuals who get stuck. So I might say to that individual, how's that working for you? How's your life changing for the better? And sort of reflect those questions that might be something they can sift through and unpack on their own, and let them you really can't force anybody to do anything. So meet them where they're at and just ask integral questions that help them reflect on their own. Right?
So I work with high schoolers, and what I've learned from working with them is that most of the time they just want to be understood. When they use their voice, they just want to be understood. So when they're using their voice, they're using it for the wrong things, because like you said, their response will be explosive. So how can me as a sister that plays a major role in their life, how can I get them to use their voice, but in a way that it will be healthy? Because I really want to learn how to maybe take control of the situation and help them not to respond in that way, because I want to hear, I want to listen. So like you said, creating that safety setting is very, very key to them too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to.
So, personally, wow. I have a great deal of respect for you. Adolescents are the most challenging, in my opinion. I'll take an addict any old day. But adolescents are tough. And and so one of the things that I think probably is happening with this age group is they're angry, and they're angry for a reason. And so now they have a safe place to share with you, and they feel safe enough to do that. So maybe setting some boundaries is the first thing that I might do. And just say, and reflect it back to them. Like, gosh, I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But today, let's practice using a more responsible voice. Let's see how we can do that and set some of those boundaries. So I get it. You're upset. You're angry. You have every right to be. But let's sit down and talk about that. And let's set some boundaries around that. So we don't yell in my office. We use our indoor voice. We don't act, we have to teach them how to channel that energy in more constructive ways. So one of the things that I like to share with people is that I can be angry, but that doesn't mean that I have to show aggression. And so separating the emotion from the behavior is often very important in helping children know that they can do that too. And then he'll say, well, I don't know how to do that. Then teach him. Okay, so tell me in a soft voice, in a gentle voice, how you're feeling and express that anger using words. Right? And so, but yeah, good luck. Ugh. Any other final thoughts or questions? Where focus goes, energy flows. Okay, and that goes for all of us too. So we're caregivers, right? And we have to make sure we step into a room of children that need us where we're whole and we're healthy and we're capable. And one of the ways you can do that is just prepare yourself. I'm going to step into this room, no matter what happens. I'm going to keep it together. I'm going to be calm, and I'm not going to let things impact me and to a point where I'm reacting, right? Difference between reacting and responding is the part of the brain that is functioning in that moment. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. Can you speak into re-victimization and direct services such as a church like ours, and what do you share with organizations that help many people with trauma as far as re-victimization?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean.
So,
What are
in
you asking?
I don't know if you read the book Help Hurting While Helping and stuff like that, as far as
How we can
what are
hurt?
ways that sometimes you've seen that people come in with trauma and then they're re-victimized when we're trying to help them as a result of us not knowing about trauma?
That's a really good question. And so I think you can probably answer that yourself, right? If a child comes in and they're acting out, and I meet them at their energy level, one of the ways that we can start is, as I said earlier, is just prepare yourself. When you walk into that room, I am okay. I do not have to yell and scream. I do not have to raise my voice. Thinking of creative ways to help bring your audience to a point where you need them. How can you do that? Think about in a classroom when a teacher flicks the lights off and on, and then you tell them, when the lights flick off and on, children, I need you to be seated here, here, here. How do we re-victimize children? Lots of ways. You have to really be careful. Am I treating these children in the way that I was treated growing up that traumatized me? And get to know your children. Understand what their cues are and how trauma in their upbringing might have looked, so that I'm not recreating that trauma. Because it is easy to do, and that's a really good question. Yes. That's tricky. I would say is that what you meant? Not how you as a teacher inflicts victim? Oh, okay. Okay. So, and sometimes children are, in the classroom can also, create trauma or re-traumatize. That child probably needs to have a therapist or a caregiver, role explored. What's going on in the home? That's what I would ask. I would be asking, what's going on at home? This kid has to come here, and therapeutic intervention. It's valuable. It can be.
What kind of advice can you give grandparents that are being parents to their grandkids, as far as the mother and father don't have time for them? They just want to drop them off with them grandparents, and they want us to play that mother and father role for these kids.
How are you playing that mother-father role, and what are you telling them about their parents?
we
How are
don't.
you supporting love?
Well, the child is 11 years old, and she comes and tells us, "Grandma, Grandpa, I want to live with you guys because mom and dad are always they're fighting. They yell at each other. They take off with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and they blame each other for that."
So
And
there's a lot of conflict in the home.
the child's already seen. She has three younger siblings, and there's a newborn baby that's disabled, and the 11-year-old's responsible for that child because mom and dad are too busy fighting and arguing, and she has to be making sure that little child gets his medication, make sure that little child is changed.
So she's been parentified.
Yeah, so she don't know how to react. She can't be a child.
Parentification is something that oftentimes, and maybe you can relate to this in your own upbringing, often it's the oldest child in a family of, 4 siblings or whatever. By virtue of age, that oldest child becomes the parent because their own parents are incapable, for whatever reason, of taking care of the family. And so, it's hard to say where you jump into these interventions. I don't know. I don't know where I would jump in. Where you could jump in, CPS. Pull them out of that home so that they do have appropriate care if it's that great, right? Maybe the grandparents should, if they can, step in and help. If there's a lot of conflict in the home, the conflict in the home is the problem, not the children. The children just come to us in our classrooms acting out, and it's, then becomes a problem, not just to themselves, but the other children in the classroom. So I have time for one more question. I probably can't answer that to your satisfaction. I apologize, but these are very complex, complicated issues. Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.